Goldie returned from the city like a storm that burst into a world where silence had long settled. Her words, full of venom and confidence, broke through the closed doors of my mind. You should rent a cheap apartment and live there, because someone who just sits at home does not deserve to live in this house. I, Lauren, remembered how my existence became hostage to this place, where the smells of memory and comfort mixed with the cold of discontent. My relatives, eager to occupy my space, did not understand that I work from home, and my husband Patrick, who lost his kindness along the way, supported Goldie in her evil intentions. They blamed me without even realizing who was actually paying for the $7,500 mortgage. The moment it dawned on me, I realized, if I leave, who will carry this load? My anger, which had accumulated, reached its peak, and, like a thundercloud, loomed menacingly over us. I defied Patrick by giving up ownership, as if severing the last ties with this house where love once reigned. I left, but soon they would face an unexpected situation that I was just beginning to realize. Remembering how I first met Patrick in the office where he worked for a cleaning company, I couldn't help feeling bitter that it was this random moment that led me to such dark times. The loss of my parents was reflected in my soul, leaving a void that could not be filled. I struggled with this reality, masking my tears and pain, while a dreary web of loneliness twisted around me. Patrick became an incomprehensible island for me, which I sailed to in search of salvation, but soon realized that I had lost myself, forgetting about the joy that once warmed my heart. Patrick came up to me as I was looking out the window, lost in my thoughts. His soft voice, like a warm light, broke through the darkness of my thoughts. "Are you okay? You look a little." There was sincerity in his question, and maybe that's what prompted me to open my soul to a stranger whose name I didn't even know. At that moment, I remembered my parents and, without holding back, told them about my loss. When Patrick heard about my parents' death, his face lit up with understanding. He said that he was close to his family, that he knew what it was like to feel lonely. I was pleased that he listened to my story, and soon we had a conversation that wrapped my soul like a warm blanket. Every time we met at work, we exchanged glances full of meanings that no one could understand if they didn't live in this world of loneliness. Our friendship quickly grew into something more, and soon after our dates began, Patrick introduced me to his parents. They, having the warmth and care that I so lacked, knew about my losses and invited me to visit. I quickly became close to them, and then, as if fate itself had guided me, I married Patrick. After the wedding, we rented an apartment next to my relatives and began a life together full of hopes and dreams. I left my job to join a company that allowed me to work remotely. I did it looking forward to the opportunity to start a family with Patrick. When I told him about the career change, his reaction was incomprehensible. He just knew that I was working from home. My salary remained the same, and this gave us the opportunity to focus on the future. Patrick earned less than me, and we agreed that I would pay the basic expenses while he deferred his salary. His hobbies were simple, and we often spent evenings walking in the park or enjoying cozy evenings together. I enjoyed the peace and comfort of our home nest, and I loved cooking for Patrick, turning every meal into a little celebration. But a few years after our marriage, a tragedy occurred. My brother-in-law's house burned down. Fortunately, my relatives were unharmed, but the loss of all their possessions, including irreplaceable photo albums, cast a shadow of grief over them. They temporarily moved in with us, and an atmosphere of sadness soon reigned in our house. I did my best to support those who once helped me cope with loss. I cooked for them, made sure they felt comfortable, even on weekends when Patrick and I went out together. However, my relatives felt like a burden and often expressed concern that they were staying with us for too long. This confusion in their eyes made me think about the future. Patrick and I decided that we would build a house where we could live with them. Although my relatives have never expressed a desire to live under the same roof, this thought began to strengthen in our hearts, and I felt that a new chapter was waiting for us on the horizon. I was saving money from my salary separately from my husband's savings, thinking that it was better to take out a mortgage sooner than later. The proposal to build a new house caused my relatives to be delighted, and soon the conversations about it became more specific. They talked about the charming old wooden building built by my great-grandfather, and how various health problems began to arise with age, which made a new house a necessity. Patrick, full of enthusiasm, also contributed his ideas, and I felt that this project was becoming part of something bigger. However, the cost of construction soon turned out to be much higher than our expectations. Despite this, I convinced myself that we were going to live in this house for a long time, and agreed to all their demands. At some point, I began to feel that something was wrong with my relationship with Patrick. He proudly told his parents that he was building the house, while the name on the mortgage remained with me. Every time he said it was his house, it undermined my trust. Rachel and Kyle, his parents, started insisting that I thanked Patrick too, but I knew he wasn't just making money, he was using my name and savings. I was alarmed that, despite his words, Patrick did not defend me, but only joked that I should be grateful to him for the opportunity to live in a new house. Every time I heard that, I was overwhelmed with disappointment. I understood that Patrick had his own pride, and I did not demand that he tell his parents the truth, but I asked him not to put the situation in that light. Patrick didn't seem to be listening, and his self-confidence grew against the backdrop of our new home. I began to notice that Patrick lied to his parents about his job, claiming that he worked for the same company where I worked, a company well known in our city. Although he had dealt with her, his statements looked overblown and did not correspond to reality. The more I realized this lie, the more distrust of Patrick began to grow in me, and I felt uncomfortable around his parents, who seemed blinded by his bragging. When we finally moved into a new house, the question of who actually built it became irrelevant, and I continued to endure the tension in the relationship. But as soon as we started settling into our new home, the relationship between me and Patrick's relatives began to change. They, like him, did not understand the concept of working from home, believing that I was just idling while sitting at the computer. Patrick often complained to them that I was just playing all day, and they seemed to completely believe it. The sarcasm of their words intensified. Patrick built such a beautiful house, and you just stay at home and play. Why don't you work a little bit and help him? These comments deeply touched me, and I felt the curtain falling, separating me from the comfort that I hoped to create in our new home. Even when I was working at the computer, Patrick's relatives often came to my room, creating unbearable discomfort. Their constant intrusion forced me to leave the house more often and eventually work in a cafe where I could concentrate at least a little. I repeatedly asked Patrick to clarify the misunderstanding of his parents, because my work actually supported our common way of life. All I needed was for him to just explain to them that I wasn't messing around, I was really working. But he just waved them off, saying that let them say whatever they want, the main thing is not to pay attention to them. The situation only got worse. I felt like his parents started bossing me around, and it became unbearable. At one point, I finally couldn't stand it and confronted them, hoping that Patrick would take my side when he saw how upset I was. But instead of supporting me, he shouted at me, silencing me, and then, shocking me, shoved a completed divorce document at me. His threat intimidated me to the core, and I, not knowing what to do, gave in to him and his parents. From that day on, their demands became completely cold, and I felt like a ghost in my own house. The only place where I could find any solace was my computer work. I immersed myself in it to forget about how my relatives and my husband humiliated me. One day, my sister-in-law Goldie, who lived in the city, returned to visit. She was going to see a new house and probably did not suspect that she would witness a new wave of accusations against me. My relatives, joyfully greeting her, started complaining about me, claiming that I was always locked in my room playing on the computer. Goldie's words reverberated in my mind like painful blows. What the hell is she doing? She must understand whose generosity allows her to live in such a beautiful house. They talked about how I had apparently completely lost touch with reality, and even Goldie seemed to support their opinion. Running away from their loud conversation, I tried not to listen, but the shocking comments only accumulated. Goldie said that I'm not just a cleaner, but a liar who couldn't even have the skills to work at home. Every word they said caused me bottomless pain, but despite this, I decided not to confront them. Folding my arms, I just gave up, believing that they wouldn't believe me anyway. Since Goldie came to visit, I found myself outside the family. She took my place at the dining table, and I couldn't eat with the others while they enjoyed the food I cooked in between work. This situation lasted for a whole week until the day of Goldie's return to the city came. Suddenly, she announced that she would live in this house too, as it was convenient for her. She had just quit her job and decided to return to the family home. Goldie talked about how tired she was of the office drama, and when she saw our new home, she said she found it even more luxurious than she expected. A feeling of betrayal stirred inside me, but I decided to keep these thoughts to myself, believing that perhaps with her arrival the situation would change at least a little. Goldie, full of confidence in her words, said, "Leaving the city to start a business here could be a great decision for me. I can work anywhere." My relatives Rachel and Kyle were beaming with delight, as if her words confirmed all their assumptions about my useless existence. Patrick, as usual, seemed pleased only with compliments about the house, and this thought only increased my inner irritation. I understood that Goldie didn't have a dedicated room in our house, and that if she was going to stay here, she would need another space, but none of them seemed to care. Goldie, having lived with us for only a week, said with a smug grin, "You should find yourself a cheap apartment and live there, Lauren. People who just play at home don't deserve to live in a house like this." I felt the adrenaline rush from anger, but before I could answer, Rachel interrupted me. "This is a great idea. You don't do anything, but you stay at home all day." In desperation, I tried to explain that my work requires concentration and effort, that I'm not just sitting at the computer. But Goldie, who had just assured me that it was possible to work from anywhere, suddenly did not understand the essence of remote work, and her words devalued all my efforts. There was something overwhelming in their absurd arguments, and anger began to fill me. Patrick seemed to enjoy this performance, just sat and laughed, watching me turn into a victim in front of my eyes. When I finally decided to tell them that the house was built in my name, and I was paying the entire mortgage, Patrick turned pale for a second. I stated the facts. The initial payment was made to my savings, and Patrick did not pay a penny. His panic was obvious, but instead of admitting the truth, he became even more aggressive, accusing me of making noise and lying. Rachel, Kyle, and Goldie, defending Patrick, kept calling me a liar. No matter how much I tried to explain that it wasn't a lie, they just didn't believe me. And at one point it dawned on me, if I really am the only one paying for a $7,500 mortgage, I had no reason to put up with this humiliating situation. Suddenly it all seemed absurd to me. If the house really belonged to Patrick, who supposedly works for a large corporation, maybe he should have kept it. I decided it was time to sign the divorce papers, which Patrick used as a threat. He was so happy that he almost danced when I suggested changing the name of the house to his name, believing that now it would be completely his property. But Patrick did not take into account one thing. To do this, it was necessary to go through a complex process. When I tried to explain all the steps to him, he just waved me off, saying that I would handle it myself. "Just do what you need to do and bring me the documents to sign," he said, completely uninterested in the details. Reluctantly, but I had to take him with me to the bank and to a lawyer for advice. Throughout this whole procedure, Patrick did not listen, but only played with his smartphone, as if it was just entertainment, and not our life, which hung in the balance. Each of his ignoring looks and disrespectful manner of communication further distanced us from each other, and I realized that all that remained was to take my fate into my own hands. When Patrick came to sign the documents, he finally showed interest. "If I sign this, the house will be registered in my name, right?" he asked, as if sincerely hoping for confirmation of his plans. I nodded, and he signed the papers with pleasure. His delight was obvious when he began to tell Rachel, Goldie, and Kyle about his successes. I was wondering if he realized that all this time he didn't actually own a house or a mortgage. Nevertheless, despite the facts, his family continued to believe in his fairy tales about working for a large corporation, while I remained unemployed for them. I watched this scene with a sense of amazement, realizing that everything was changing. After the change of ownership and the divorce, Patrick stated, "We're going on a trip to celebrate, so you better leave while we're gone." He seemed to be looking forward to completing all the procedures to take Rachel, Goldie, and Kyle on a ridiculous trip abroad for 15 whole days. During this time, I decided to sell all the furniture and appliances that I brought to the house and pack my things in the car, preparing to leave this place. At the same time, I was looking for a new house and soon found a suitable apartment on the top floor of a multi-story building. Luck smiled on me. An apartment worth about $8 million turned out to be affordable. I decided to boldly buy it, believing that it was exactly what I needed for a new start. Moving to a new place was a real liberation for me. The last years of living with Rachel, Kyle, and Patrick were full of stress, and now I was excited about the prospects of a new life. I remembered the inheritance from my parents, which I had invested wisely before I married Patrick. These investments were a huge success, and now I had several $1,000,000 that I planned to use for a quiet retirement. Keeping my assets secret was a wise decision. If I had shared this information with Rachel, Kyle, and Goldie, they would no doubt have teamed up to try to get my money. Living with this family, I realized how careless they are about money. The house I lived in with Patrick and his parents was decorated according to their preferences, and therefore moving to a new apartment was a real relief for me. Now I had the opportunity to create a space that would reflect only my desires and tastes. I thought carefully about the interior, surrounding myself with my favorite things and leaving behind everyone who could snide at Patrick. I was finding joy again in working from home, and as soon as everything was settled, I planned to sign up for a cooking class or a yoga studio. Finally, I could enjoy a pleasant and free time. In the evening, when they returned from a trip, there was a call from Patrick. He must have realized that the furniture and appliances were gone. Upon returning home, he demanded to return them, but I did not pay attention to his words. All this was bought with my money, and now it's my choice to dispose of it as I see fit. I didn't want to leave anything of my own in the house of those who caused me so much suffering, even furniture and household appliances. When I informed Patrick that I had already sold them, he nevertheless demanded that I immediately buy them back. "It's impossible," I replied. "You, who work for a large corporation, should just buy new ones." And, without waiting for his answer, she hung up the phone. He called me several times that day, but I ignored all his attempts to contact me. It has been several months since Patrick and his family returned from a trip abroad. I completely forgot about my old life and had a great time building relationships with my neighbors. One day, returning from cooking lessons, I was invited by a friend who lives on the floor below. Suddenly, the call from Patrick rang again. I was wary, but thinking that there might be problems with the documents, I decided to answer. "What is this?" he shouted, and I, remembering his hysterical notes, felt the old resentments come flooding back. Patrick seemed to be in a panic. He noticed the loan repayment amount that came in the mail, and his eyes widened in shock when he saw that the amount was $7,500 per month. I understood that his outburst of rage was caused by the realization of his hopelessness. "Of course it's impossible," he shouted. "Do you even realize how much this house cost?" I answered slowly, shockingly, the mortgage was not paid. I couldn't help but notice his confused face as he tried to figure out how he could be in such a situation. The bank confirmed that everything was still valid, but it seemed that it was already sure of something else. Although Patrick signed the mortgage transfer, his confidence that everything had already been settled spoke of his deep delusion. He kept panicking, looking for a way out, but I couldn't help anymore. I sat next to him, watching his confusion as he seemed to begin to realize the gravity of the situation. I was thinking about how he would continue to look for a place to live. Patrick probably realized that he still relied on my financial resources to cover expenses even after the divorce. Now he had to face reality. I was curious about what kind of life my pretentious ex-husband lived. He probably enjoyed luxury with his parents until it was time to pay the mortgage. What are you going to do now? A thought struck me. I looked at his upset face and couldn't resist telling him the truth. Unfortunately, I moved into a luxury apartment with the money I earned from successful investments. His silence lasted a few moments before I, satisfied with his perplexity, hung up the phone. After that, there were no calls from him, and I decided that Patrick had finally dealt with the situation. However, he soon called again, and there was panic in his voice. "Lauren, we need help. Our house has been invaded," he exclaimed, and in the background I heard the desperate voices of his parents Rachel and Kyle, as well as his sister Goldie. Their cries for help seemed to echo in my mind, causing a slight feeling of triumph. Patrick begged me, assuring me that a law enforcement officer had come to them with the news that the house was going to be auctioned. I was shocked. How could such a catastrophe have been allowed to happen? The officer explained that they would be evicted after the transfer of ownership, and at that moment it became clear to me that Patrick and his family did not take seriously the threats posed by financial problems. I decided to find out if they had received warning letters. Patrick, confused, could not answer. At first, he stated that they had not received anything, but after persistent questioning, he finally admitted that perhaps the letters had indeed arrived, but he simply ignored them. "I thought someone else would do it," he said in a low voice, and I couldn't help but get annoyed. Each of them, including Rachel and Kyle, believed that someone else would take responsibility for the financial obligations. Now that it was time for a one-time repayment of the loan, it became clear that their hopes had not been fulfilled. I heard him begging again, "Can't you do something now? Pay off the loan." His voice sounded so helpless that I could barely hide my disappointment. I replied that they could use their savings to repay the loan, but he just shook his head, clearly not understanding the seriousness of the situation. Kyle squandered his funds on crazy trips, and Goldie, who was fired for fraud, still harbored illusions about her own success. She returned home, hoping for her parents, and did not even realize how fragile her financial situation was. "You pretended to work for a large corporation, but in fact you were saving money to cover our common expenses," I remarked, seeing his face change with realization. Rachel, Kyle, and Goldie lived in luxury, not caring that the ground was burning under their feet. Their disregard for reality eventually led to this hopeless situation. While they were blaming each other, Patrick suddenly started clinging to me. "Please, Lauren, you live in a luxury apartment. Let's live there together again." This moment showed the depth of his despair. I looked at my new walls, at my new life, and realized that he had never understood what it meant to really fight for his own happiness. I refused, clearly realizing that we are now divorced and, as far as I understand, have become strangers to each other. I used to feel a little sorry for him, but now, hearing the voices of Rachel, Kyle, and Goldie in the background, I felt a sense of determination fill me. I firmly declined Patrick's offer. His family reacted instantly to my refusal. Insults rained down like hail. "You heartless swindler. Thief!" There were pejorative shouts, and even Patrick, my ex-husband, joined them. It was unbearable. Even though everything that was happening was the result of their own actions, there was not even a hint of remorse. At first they hurled accusations at me, but soon all four of them began to quarrel among themselves, leaving me aside. I decided that I would never contact these people again. I hung up the phone quietly and blocked Patrick's number. Soon, a few days later, I came across an alarming headline in the newspaper. The article about how father and son got into a fight and called the police made me suspect that it was about my ex-husband and his father. I decided to contact a mutual friend who lived not far from them to find out the details. As expected, the incident in question really concerned them. The The article reported a fight that occurred shortly after my conversation with Patrick. A neighbor noticed the noise and called the police, which led to their arrest. Patrick, his father Rachel and Goldie suffered injuries that took about 3 weeks to heal. After a warning from the police, they were released, but this incident left its mark. Patrick was severely reprimanded at work, although he was not fired. Rumors of a fight quickly spread through the company, and he began to feel uncomfortable. Soon, a buyer was found for their house, and Patrick and his family were forced to move out. They moved into an old, cramped apartment infested with bedbugs, the exact opposite of what they had enjoyed before. Every day in their lives brought new problems, bedbugs, complaints from neighbors. Goldie and Rachel tried to solve these issues in a panic, but they themselves faced difficulties at work. They were eventually fired, especially Goldie, whose embezzlement past became widely known. Now, it seems, they were forced to live only on the income of Patrick, who, as I learned, began to persistently ask our mutual acquaintances about where I live. I was advised to be careful, even if he somehow finds my apartment, the concierge just won't let him in. I gratefully accepted this advice and asked the concierge to be on the lookout. Now, after everything that happened, I realize that the end of this story has come. Less than a year has passed since I left that house, but it all seemed like an event of the distant past. I have fully adapted to life in my luxurious apartment, enjoying days filled with hobbies and work. There was only peace ahead, and I decided that for a while I would enjoy my carefree single life, not thinking about marriage and the past.